fixture not only in the county, the area, and a strong fixture of good in the community, but also in this parish community, as he's preached for Hat for a few decades now. We're thankful for the good that he does there continually, and we're thankful for he and his good wife, Mary Carol, who's here with him tonight, discussing the topic, when our heart feels hurt or is hurt. And so we look forward to diving into the truth of God's word about that. Brother Brandon.
When I was younger, I remember I was probably 8 to 10. Mary Carol's going to be shocked by that because all of my stories happened when I was 12 to 13, but I know I had to be younger than that. I remember sitting in my room on my bed with a headache so bad that I began to have hallucinations of colors and shapes on the wall and on the ceiling. And that pain wasn't just a singular experience. It happened fairly regularly throughout my young adulthood and early to late childhood. And dealing with that pain was difficult. I didn't know what to do with it. I was a kid. I didn't know what was happening or why it was happening, and I began to do some research, some reading. I was always an avid reader, and I became aware of a condition called CIP. It is congenital insensitivity to pain. These are people who are born in such a way that they are unable to feel pain. And I thought, that's fantastic, right? An 8 or 9-year-old, you can't feel pain. Think of all the things that you could do. Think of all the things that you could accomplish. Think of all that you could make it through if you had the inability to feel pain. And I began to read more and more about that condition that I was so fascinated by as a kid, and then realized that it used to be that people who had that disease didn't live very long. If I had had that disease, I probably would have died at 12 or 13 when I had appendicitis, because that part of my body was infected and growing infection, and it would have burst and filled me with infection, and I would have died, never knowing that anything was wrong. The things that affect our heart are there for a reason. And when we look at the different areas where we can be hurt, this topic's a little different than some of the others because it is one that goes through a litany of pain and loneliness and sorrow and agony and distress, and all of those conditions create hurt, right? But hurt is a thing in itself as well. And so while I was experiencing physical pain, it was causing me hurt. And what we're going to see is when we look at physical pain, we're going to talk about physical pain, we're going to talk about emotional pain, and we're going to talk about spiritual pain. And each one is different, and each one can cause our heart to hurt. Physical pain. So we were raising our daughters, and one of the things that would happen when they were very young is if they fell, if they got a bruise, if they got bumps, they would look up and they would say, 1, 2, 3, I'm tough. Right? Because we didn't want them crying and pitching a fit and thinking the world was coming to an end every time they fell down. Every time they got a little bump or a little bruise, every time something hurt them, it wasn't a cause for great distress and tears and agony. 1, 2, 3, I'm tough. But what if that pain isn't just falling down? Well, what if it isn't just something that you can get over pretty quick? What if it's not just a bump or a bruise? What if it's continuous, daily, excruciating pain? My younger sister is dealing with debilitating back degeneration. The discs in her back are just falling apart. And she is in constant pain. And it's causing her heart to hurt. And while we might minimize some ideas about physical pain, it's not always true. All right? And so we can see this pain cycle. And if you look at the end of depression and fatigue, right? Those are conditions of the heart. And that's what can result from even physical pain. Stress creates emotional pain, and we deal with emotional pain, and it can be a difficult thing for us to deal with. It can cause us hurt. Emotionally, we hurt when things, typically, when things begin to cascade, when we create, because of what we've experienced, we create a negative self-image. I must be the problem. This has happened, that has happened. It's got to be me, right? I must be the problem in this situation or that situation, or because this occurred, I must have done something wrong. I must have not said the right thing. I must not have done the right thing. And that causes emotionally a lot of pain. Eventually, that emotional pain can cause us to believe that we are not worthy of relationships. We're not worthy of companionship. We're not worthy of a community, being part of a community. Well, I won't be accepted. They can't really want me. It leads to dopamine addictions, so phone, games, drugs, alcohol. It leads to escapism. It leads to a desire for perfectionism. If I can only get my job right, then people will like me. If I can only get my house to look right, then people in my neighborhood might accept me. If my kids are perfect, then the other parents, they'll like me. And that's trying to deal with emotional hurt. We also have spiritual hurt. It's a buzzword kind of right now, church hurt, right? And the idea that the definition of church hurt is typically seen this way. It refers to emotional, relational, or spiritual pain someone experiences as a result of being mistreated, judged, betrayed, ignored, or spiritually manipulated by individuals or leaders within a church community. You ever been in the church? You ever been judged in the church? You ever been betrayed in the church? Most of us have, right? And so we've all been, and I'm going to put quotes around it because it's not really a good church hurt. Because we open up to our family in the church. We open up to the people who are supposed to be following the example of Christ, and we trust them more than we do anybody else in community. But they're people. And people fail us. And we get hurt. And so what do we do with all of that? Because those are ways in which we experience pain, but it also leads to us hurting. And so the definition we're going to use is the idea that hurt is the feeling that lets us know we have the capacity to be wounded. A child who has not lived much in the world is betrayed for the first time, and they get really hurt by it. They're experiencing the pain of betrayal, but that leads them to be hurt because they finally recognize that this is even a possibility. This is even something that could happen. They're wounded emotionally, relationally, or spiritually, and that we are in need of comfort and healing. When we take that idea and we grow with it or from it, what we find is that all emotional and spiritual healing comes through relationship. All emotional and spiritual healing comes through relationship. It won't let me go back, so sorry. That's the next slide, but that's an interesting, thank you. That's an interesting thought, right? That we can be caused to have pain physically, and what I'm going to say is that that physical pain has to do with us. It's encapsulated within us. That emotional pain has to deal with our relationship with other people, and our spiritual pain has to deal with our relationship with God. And that pain is caused by relationship. Physical pain, our relationship with our body. Emotional pain, our relationship with other people. Spiritual pain, our relationship with God. And what's interesting is that the thing that causes us pain is the very thing that can heal it. And so we have to be careful. We have to be careful because that truth can become an obstacle to healing, because the very thing that heals us, relationships, are the very thing that wounded us previously. And that paradox can lead us to defend against taking ownership of pain. It can cause us to say, well, relationships caused my pain, therefore I'm feeling hurt, and I don't want relationships anymore. We fear that our hearts will be wounded again. We escape pain by defending against the possibility of it happening again. And so we isolate ourselves. We're going to see that in a second, but we're going to see the result of that type of behavior. So hurt. Hurt comes in different forms from different places, but it's all dealt with the same way. Relationship and connection. So we're going to look at a few examples of pain and of hurt and how that results. So Absalom is the first. His story is told in 2 Samuel chapters 13 through 18, but we're going to focus mainly on chapter 13. And in chapter 13, what happens is his half-brother, Amnon, desires Absalom's full sister, Tamar. So Tamar and Absalom are full brother-sister, and Amnon is a half-brother to Tamar. And Tamar falls in lust with Tamar. He does not fall in love with her, but he falls in lust with her. And he desires to have her sexually. And she would not, because they were not married. And she would not allow that to take place. And she begs him to ask her father, David, for her betrothal, and that's probably what would happen, and that would rectify the situation. And that wasn't good enough for Amnon. And Amnon forces himself upon his half-sister. That's pretty gross. It's painful. And it caused a lot of family hurt. David was angered by what Amnon had done. Absalom was enraged by what Amnon had done. But Absalom was in no position to do anything about it, while David, the king and father, was. And you know what David did? He's the man after God's own heart. And for a week, he did nothing. And for 2 weeks, he did nothing. And for 2 months, he did nothing. And for a year, he did nothing. And for 2 years, Absalom's pain and hurt had grown. And he calls all of his brothers together, and he kills Amnon. And when we ignore pain and hurt, the result is that it creates within us anger, resentment, loneliness, because that pain, right? We're feeling that hurt. And that hurt is caused by others, and so I just don't want to engage with them anymore because they're just going to hurt me again. And for Absalom, that had to be true concerning his father, who had not justified his sister, who he had to see over and over again. This would lead, through the rest of the story of Absalom's life, to his broken relationship with his father, broken to the point that he would take David's concubines and parade them in front of the nation in order to say, I should be king instead of my father David. To seek to kill his father over and over and over again, and ultimately lead to his own death. Why? So the Bible doesn't say it this way, right? So we have to think like a clinician or a psychologist and try to get into the mind of Absalom, but I do believe it's because his heart was hurting. And he was a man who didn't know how to deal with it. And it caused a lot of anger and resentment and loneliness. And I think when we see Absalom, we can see the danger of hiding our pain. And so let's not be like that. Let's not do that. And so what do we do? How do we manage our hurt or deal with the hurt that we feel? Well, I think there's one individual that might have some compassion for those that are hurting. Job, you know the story of Job. It's a difficult story. It's a difficult story for us to wrap our heads around. But Satan's been walking on the earth, and he wants to test someone. And God says, "Hey, if you've been testing everybody, have you tried to test Job?" And it's like, oh, no, don't do that. don't throw your faithful servant in front of the enemy. But he puts him to the test. And Satan is allowed to take everything from Job physically, and he takes all of his children, and he takes all of his possessions, and then he takes his health. And Job is left, I believe, with his wife because she was a temptation for him. Instead of giving him good advice, she was also giving him bad advice. Curse God and die, right? And he is suffering. His entire life is hurt. Job 10, 1 and 2. I loathe my life. I will give free utterance to my complaint. I will speak in the bitterness of my soul. But notice verse 2. I will say to my God, do not condemn me. Let me know why you contend against me. And then look at chapter 14, verses 1 and 2. Man who is born of woman is few of days and full of trouble. He comes out like a flower and withers. He flees like a shadow and continues not. How did Job make it through? Well, he had 3 friends, right? But quotes around friends too. They weren't much in the way of friendship. They gave him horrible advice over and over again. They believed that he was a sinner and he deserved what he was getting. And so they weren't much comfort to him, but at least he had someone to talk to. At least he had people to communicate with. And in that communication, he comes to a resolution. And we see it in verse 10. I will say to God. And so with all of the hurt that Job is experiencing, there is still a knowledge, a conversation, a desire for God. And that's what helps him make it through. He's able to turn to the one who had promised a redeemer. Job's the one who says, I know that my Redeemer lives, who had made that promise and would uphold it. And that comfort of relationship with his Redeemer helps him make it through. The next example is from Elijah. 1 Kings chapter 19. The setting of the story is that Elijah has just had this great battle of the gods. He's prayed for rain, and it's begun to rain, and so the nation is getting back to normal. But in this confrontation of the gods, Ahab has called the prophets of Baal together, and they pray, and they try to get their God to consume an altar, and it doesn't happen. And Elijah kind of prods them a little bit. Maybe your God is out or just not able to hear you. You need to call louder. And so they cut themselves bleeding, yelling and screaming for their God. And of course, he doesn't answer because he's not real. And Elijah takes a step back. He has them pour water, dig a moat, pour water over the altar to God to the point that it is flooded completely. God, let them know that you are God. That's his prayer. Fire comes down from on high, consumes the altar, consumes the sacrifice, and consumes the water that's in the moat. And the people turn on the prophets of Baal, and they kill them all. And the river runs red with their blood. And he has overcome. The point was to cause the people to choose either God or Baal, and they've obviously chosen God. And he leaves from that event, and he approaches the king's mansion, and he gets word that Jezebel, the king's wife, has said, "You killed my prophets, I'm going to kill you." And this prophet of God who has just witnessed fire come down from on high, consume a sacrifice, consume the altar, burn up the water, and the prophets be killed, runs in fear and anguish. Why? Because it hurt his heart. It hurt him to his heart. Because I've done all this work, and God has done all of this work, and nobody's listening. And he goes and he hides under a juniper tree or a broom tree. And here's a man who had prayed that it wouldn't rain for 3 years, and it didn't rain. And he prayed for a child to be restored who had died, and the child is brought back to life based on his prayer. And he prayed that fire would come down, and fire came down. And he prayed that it would rain, and it rained. This is a man who knows the power of prayer. And you know what his prayer is under that tree? Because his heart is hurting. Let me die. I want to die. And God hears his prayer. And instead of smacking him around, right? How dare you? I created you. I'm the sovereign one that decides death and life. And instead of anger and frustration, God sends to him an angel. And the angel says, "Here's some food, and here's some water. Eat it and go back to sleep. Because you're not you when you're hungry." When you're dealing with physical pain, you're not you. You're not the person that you normally are, and he's affected by that. And then God allows that rest and that food to take hold, and then he calls him to a mountain and to a cave and shows him a great fire to make 4th of July look like tiddlywinks, right? And then an earthquake, and then a wind. And then after all three of those, a still small voice. I know that you're hurting. I know that you're hurting spiritually because you feel like I haven't done enough, or that people aren't able to see me clearly enough, but I need you to see me, Elijah. And God helps him overcome his hurt by reminding him of who God is. Elijah, see, you're focused on that fire that you saw come down and the fact that it didn't change people's hearts. I'm not going to change people's hearts with fire, with wind, or with an earthquake. What I'm going to change people's hearts with is a small, still voice. And then he gives him the last part. You're emotional because you feel like you're all alone. There's 7,000 others who have not bowed the knee to Baal. You need to go do some work. I've got 2 people that need to be anointed. You need to get back to work. You need to finish what you're doing. But then you need to find Elisha, who would be to Elijah a son in the faith. You're hurting. You're emotional because you feel like you're all alone. I'm going to send you to someone who's going to love you to the day that you are taken up into the chariots of fire. When my heart is hurting because of pain, I need to deal with it. I need to address it. I need to do everything that I can to take care of it. When my heart is hurting spiritually, I need to remember who God is. He's never going to leave me. He's never going to forsake me. He's given me his word that is everlasting. And when I'm hurting because of other people, I need to remember that there are good people out there. I may have met 10 jerks in a row, but maybe that 11th will make all the difference. We see the example of Jesus, right? Jesus knew what it was to hurt. Jesus wept. John 11:35. His hurt would culminate on the cross, and I think even there we can see 3 areas of pain or hurting. He obviously hurt physically. John 19:28. After this, Jesus, knowing that all was now finished, said, to fulfill the scripture, I thirst. A thirst that bitter gall was not going to solve. And so on the cross, his physical pain was never to be relieved. Every breath, a gasp. Every movement, shooting pain through nerves in his hands and his feet. Physical pain, he would not escape on this earth in physical form on the cross. He experienced emotional pain. Judas arrives with a kiss, right? Can you think of anything more painful emotionally? How about when you're being led to the cross? Being lifted up from the ground to look out and see Peter cursing in denial. What about hearing those who stood by, Luke 23, verse 35, saying, he saved others, let him save himself. If he is the Christ of God, that he is the chosen one. The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine and saying, if you are the king of the Jews, save yourself. For me, that wouldn't be much of an issue. It wouldn't hurt me as emotionally. It would hurt me emotionally, but it would hurt me as emotionally as it would have Jesus, because he could have called 12 legions of angels. Matthew 26, verse 53. We sing 10,000 angels, right? He could have called 10,000 angels. The number's probably closer to 60 to 72,000 angels. But he died alone for you and me. Can you imagine that type of restraint? The denial of vindication, the hurt emotionally. he was hurt spiritually. Jesus was fully man and fully God. I'm not super comfortable with the idea of saying that Jesus was hurt spiritually, but I don't know how else to explain what happens in Matthew 27, verses 45 and 46. Now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? If that isn't an expression of spiritual pain and hurt, I don't know what is. A connection that was temporarily interrupted in some form or fashion. Which leads us to the beauty of the ascension, right? Where all is made right. No more pain for Jesus. No more hurting physically. No more emotional pain as he arrives in heaven looking down. No more spiritual pain dealing with the separation between him and God. So how do we heal? We see the prescription that God gave Elijah, and I think it's a good one. I think it's a prescription that we can follow. We see how he deals with Job and Job's reliance upon God, and we see Jesus as he is on the cross, and that relationship with the Father is brought back to its beginning as he ascends. But what about us? Well, when we see our healing, it's going to happen this way. We have to acknowledge physical hurt. We have to acknowledge it. If you don't know that you're hurting physically, you can't take care of it. And by acknowledging that you're hurting, then you can have a connection to yourself. You can further your relationship internally to deal with it. You may not overcome it. You may have to suffer that physical pain for the rest of your life, but that doesn't mean that it has to sever who you are as a person. You don't have to lose yourself to the hurt. Eat right, hydrate, and rest. That's the prescription God gave to Elijah. In terms of emotional hurt, acknowledge it. And then look to those relationships. Confront the relationships that are causing you pain, emotional pain, and confront them and reconcile as much as is in you. Then put the rest on God. Romans 12, verse 18. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all men. And finally, we look at the idea of spiritual hurt and how do we deal with it. First, we've got to acknowledge it. Well, we can't pretend we don't hurt. We acknowledge it. We recognize our relationship is to God. And then we can recognize where the true pain is and seek God's grace. And that will allow us then to reframe our pain. It will allow us to reframe those things that are difficult within us. I think that that's what we find in James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet various trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. I have trials, I have hurt, they produce steadfastness. Steadfastness to what? Our relationship to God. Romans chapter 5, beginning in verse 3. Not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that our suffering produces endurance. Endurance to what? Our relationship to God. 1 Peter 1, 6 and 7. In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested with fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation or revealing of Jesus Christ. The hurt that we endure can lead us to a place where we experience the praise, glory, and honor of Jesus our Savior. Don't ignore it. It's there for a reason, and it could save your soul. I'll stop there.